of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. I tell you, I really needed to pray that prayer tonight because I'm about to talk to you about something I don't know much about. I'm about to talk to you about wine. I don't know much about wine, so I spent some time reading about it this week. Did you know that Washington is the second largest producer of premier wines in the country? Over 900 wineries in Washington. Over 350 commercial grape growers in Washington. Over 50,000 acres of vineyards in Washington. That's an area the size of Napa Valley, California. Did you know that? I didn't know that until this week. I don't know much about wine. I only buy it on special occasions, and when I do buy it, I'm usually picking it out based off the label. You know, I don't mean based off reading the label, I mean the label. I mean like, is that an interesting label? Well, this one's more interesting. I like the picture on that label. That's how I pick out wine. And then I get it home and I'm usually disappointed because I'll open it up and find out that wasn't a good way to pick wine. Because inside it tastes like it's made out of wild grapes. It's the same kind of complaint that was rising out of the scriptures that we had for tonight. From Isaiah chapter 5, we hear that complaint rising, and it's rising out of a song. It's a song that Isaiah sings, he says, for his beloved. He sings about his beloved who put a vineyard on a fertile hill. It wasn't just any hill. This was a good hill with good soil. And he worked that soil, and he cleared it of stones. And then he planted the choicest of vines. These would be vines that have been reared by other vintners and have produced wonderful fruit. And they've been placed into this vineyard to grow. And he built a watchtower in it, so as the owner of the vineyard, he could stand up there and he could survey the whole vineyard and what was taking place, making sure animals did not infiltrate it, making sure his workers were tending to the vines. And then he hewn a wine press in it, right there in the vineyard. That way they could produce the wine and ferment it right there, so there was no chance of spoilage in transport. He says in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 4, what more could I have done for my vineyard that I did not do it? And yet in verse 4 is where the complaint rises out, because that's where he says, when I looked for it to produce grapes, why did it produce wild grapes? You see, everything looked good. The bottle looked good. Right there on the top it said the Lord's vineyard, because Isaiah tells us about the beloved. See, this has been a song to his beloved, but then we find out who the beloved is. The beloved is the Lord. In verse 7, Isaiah tells us, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. It's the Lord's vineyard, and that's what it says on the bottom, the Lord's vineyard. And then underneath that, we get some of the more details. It's a heavenly vintage of divine grapes. And then down below it says family owned and manually pressed and long extraction techniques used. All in the fine print across the bottom label. It's enough to make me pick up the bottle and put it in the cart. Except that I don't know that much about choosing wine. And so when the Lord looked to see what was in the bottle, it wasn't what he expected. And, you know, I need to learn about how to choose a bottle of wine. And so I did some reading on that this week too. And maybe I can help enlighten you. What I found out was that if the wine bottle says on it, grown, produced, and bottled, and then it'll say where, this one says Napa, California. If it says grown, produced, and bottled, that's actually the most restrictive kind of labeling. It means what we normally think of when we buy a bottle of wine from a winery, that the grapes were actually grown by fields that the winery leases or owns, so it has control over the growth of those grapes. From the time that they start to grow until the time they're harvested, it actually ferments those grapes right there on site and puts them into the bottle. Everything from the tending of the grapes to the slapping on the label, it all happens in the winery. Grown, produced, and bottled by. It's the most restrictive kind of labeling. But if your label says what this label says produced and bottled by, or made and bottled by, well, the grapes that are in here could have been grown anywhere. And not only that, but 25% of what's in here might not have been fermented by the winery itself. It might have been fermented at another winery somewhere else, and they just mixed it in. The only requirement for putting produced and bottled by is that at least 3/4 of what's in here has to be fermented by the winery that's bottling it. The rest could come from anywhere. The grapes could come from anywhere too. Oh, but then if you're looking at a wine bottle and it says vinted or cellared by, those words sound kind of chic to me. Put that in my cart. But beware, say those who are wine aficionados, because it says vintage or cellared by. It means that this wine wasn't produced by the people who put it in the bottle. In fact, it might not even be all the same wine. It's just a collection of random wines that could have come from anywhere. Somebody else made them, somebody else grew them, somebody else fermented them. They've all been mixed together and put in that bottle. And it might not only be wine. They might also put in some sugar in with it and maybe some other flavoring to try to make it taste better. Because when you mix wines like that, they don't always taste that good. And so if that's what you get. If you get vinted by or cellared by, watch out. And this is what's happening to the Lord. This is the Lord's vineyard. And he took care of it, and he dug it, and tended the vines, and he put choice vines in it. And then when he went to uncork the bottle, he found out it was vinted and cellared wine. This isn't the wine that he had planted. It's not the wine he tended, and it's not the wine he intended to harvest. Instead, this is a vinted and cellared wine. It came from somewhere else. It is not wine of the Lord's planting. In Isaiah 5, verse 7, Isaiah tells us how the Lord knows this. See, the Lord knows it for sure, because the Lord knows exactly what kind of vines he planted. It says in Isaiah 5, verse 7, that he planted justice, and instead he found bloodshed. It says he planted righteousness, and instead he found an outcry. And this is where the Song of the Beloved takes a turn towards a graphic rhyme. And you kind of lose that in English, but one of my professors in the seminary called this the gangster rap of the Bible, and he actually liked to rap it for the students. I'm not going to do that for you tonight. But you can kind of hear where it would come from in Hebrew, because what the Lord says here is that he looked for mishpat, justice, and he got mishpat, bloodshed. He looked for tzedakah, righteousness, and he got tzedakah, an outcry. But what he looked for wasn't what he found when he opened up the bottle. It was not it. It was not fruit of the Lord's planting. Well, then, Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, begins singing this same song, the Song of the Beloved. Only in Matthew, it's not called a song, it's called a parable, but you'll notice the lyrics are the same. So in chapter 21 of Matthew, verse 33, the beginning starts out, there was a master of a house who planted a vineyard, and he put a fence around it, he dug a wine press in it, built a tower in it, and then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. But this is where Jesus, in parabling this song, picks up and adds verses to it. Because he goes beyond what Isaiah said in the Song for a Beloved. Jesus said that the master went to another country and leased it to tenants. And then later, when it was time for the fruit, he sent his servants to the tenants. And instead of just telling us about the justice that the Lord planted, the mishpat, and the mishpach that he got, or the tzedakah that he planted, and the tzedakah he got out, the outcry. Jesus actually describes the outcry for us. Here's the outcry. When the servants of the master came to pick up the fruit, the outcry was, let's kill him. That's what the tenants said. And Jesus says that's what they did. They beat one, they killed one, they stoned another. And do you know what? Isaiah was one of those servants. That hadn't happened yet when Isaiah was authoring this Song of the Beloved. But it happened by Jesus' day. Isaiah was one of the servants who was killed. Isaiah, after writing the Song of the Beloved, went on to prophesy under the reigns of Uzziah and Jotham and Ahaz and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. But Jewish tradition says in the Talmud that after Hezekiah, Isaiah was executed by Hezekiah's son Manasseh. And in graphic fashion, he was actually sawn in two. Now that's mishpach. That's bloodshed. And that's what happened to Isaiah. What's more, Jesus said it didn't stop. It kept happening. And not only that, but afterwards, the owner of the vineyard sent his son and said, they will respect my son. Oh, and then it came again, the tzedakah, the outcry. It came again when they said, oh, here's the son, let's kill him. And they thought, then we will get the vineyard, and we'll get to produce whatever kind of grapes we want, and whatever kind of wines we want, and then we'll get all the rewards. And this is where Jesus, paraboling this song, turns it rather graphic, too. And I don't know if it's in rhyme or not, but this is where he said, the people respond, well, he will put those wretches to a swift death, and he will let out the vineyards to those who will give him their share of the fruits in its season. Now, this hadn't taken place at the time that Jesus was speaking this. It hadn't taken place when he was turning this song into a parable, but it was going to in short order. This is Matthew chapter 1. In just a few chapters, that exactly is going to take place. Jesus is the Son who was sent. And the house of Israel, they are the vineyard of the Lord's planting. And it's the leaders of the house of Israel and the men of Judah, his pleasant planting, they're the ones who decided to put Jesus to death. Oh, and the rest of this took place too. And then he let out the vineyard to new tenants who would give him their share of the fruit in their seasons. And you know what? You and I are those new tenants. See, we've been brought into this by God's grace. The Lord has not given up on his vineyard. No matter what has happened, the beloved loves this vineyard. And this is what the Psalms say about our God. His never-ending love endures forever. His steadfast love endures forever. Endures so much forever that he starts a new vineyard. And he begins this vineyard again with his son. Yeah, that's right. The same son that they killed. Well, God raised him from the dead and started a new vineyard again with him. Except that he didn't at this time choose the choicest of vines from the children of men to plant in this vineyard. Instead, he chose just one vine. And this a vine of heavenly origin. He planted his son, Jesus himself, in the vineyard. But I told you, we've been brought into this. We who really, on our own, would be producing wild grapes too, have been brought into this. And how is it that we have been brought in? I mean, what really do we know about wine? Okay, you probably know more about wine than I do, but what do we know about the Lord's wine? What do we know about producing the fruits of his righteousness, his tzedakah? What do we know about producing his mishpat, his justice in our lives? Not enough to make it grow in the vineyard, but that choice vine, the true vine, Jesus, this is what grows from him. Isaiah talked about it all the way back in his day. Isaiah said in Isaiah 42, verse 3, he said, in faithfulness, he will bring forth justice. Isaiah 53, verse 11, he said, by his knowledge, my righteous one, my servant, will make many to be righteous, because he will bear their iniquities. See, this is how we have been brought into this. Not because we're some choice vines who don't produce the rotten fruit that Israel produced. We'd be producing the same thing. But we've been brought in because he has taken away all of our rotten fruit. All of our wild grapes and sour grapes, they've been removed by him. In the church, we call that forgiveness. But if we're sticking with the metaphor that's here in the parable, it's like the Lord took all that sour wine that's in our lives and he poured it out. Because it was just vintage. It was just cellar wine. It didn't come from him to begin with. And instead it filled it with a wine of the Lord's making. Drawn from a heavenly vineyard. A holy vintage. It's the Lord's wine, not ours. So that's why when we have the opportunity to see somebody who's been maybe treated harshly, they've been done wrong, they've been neglected, they've been insulted, somebody else has put one over on them, and if we show love to that person and care about them and show concern and bring justice into their lives, that's the Lord's righteousness. You know, as I think about this, I think about what the Lord said in John chapter 15. Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. And not only that, but in John chapter 2, Jesus' first miracle is changing water into wine. Do you ever wonder why Jesus' first miracle is changing water into wine? I've wondered that before. It's not in Matthew's gospel, it's in John, so we're jumping gospels. But Matthew doesn't talk about Jesus' first miracle. John does. Specifically tells us it's his first miracle. And he changes water into wine. Wow, why would he do that? Maybe it has something to do with these vineyard songs of the Lord. Because at the end of that miracle, this is John chapter 2, verse 10, when the servant brought the master of ceremonies a glass of that water, now changed to wine, to have him taste it, he said, most people drink the good wine first, and then after everybody's had their fill, serve the poor wine. But you have saved the best wine until now. This is what the Lord does. When the Lord makes wine, He makes the best wine. And now is the time in the course of salvation history. Now is the time. It's late in the wedding feast, and it's time for that good wine to be revealed. The wine of the Lord's making. And that is every bit as much of a miracle as the turning of water into wine in John chapter 2. And so when we do see that person who's kind of been done wrong, and we show love and mercy to them and exhibit a righteousness and a justice in their lives, well, that's every bit as much of a miracle as when the Lord turned water into wine in John chapter 2. Or when you and I had the opportunity to hide behind lies, or maybe indulge in secret, or even skim a little bit off the top because we know nobody else is looking. But instead we choose not to, and we choose honesty and integrity, and we choose the truth. That's the Lord's righteousness. That's tzedakah in our lives. And that doesn't come from inside us. It only habitually comes in our lives when we are connected to the true vine, because that's what comes from Jesus. This is why Jesus said in John 15, verse 4, after saying that he was the vine and we are the branches, he said, "Abide in me and I in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." That's why at Holy Cross, as we renewed our mission statement just this past year, and revised it, and tailored it, and shortened it, and we affirmed that all last February in our voters meeting, and we're starting to put it into place. We've intentionally put this into our mission. We've said that we are belonging, believing, and bearing fruit in Jesus. It's a threefold mission, and all three of those are wrapped up and go together. We're belonging, meaning we belong to the vine. We abide in the vine in Jesus. And we belong here in the Lord's vineyard among others who too are growing in Jesus. That's belonging. And we're believing. We're not mistreating the servants of the Master the way they did in ancient Israel. And we're accepting the message about Jesus. We're believing it. And we're believing in the news about his Son. We're not killing the Son. And we know that it's because of his death and resurrection that we've been brought into this vineyard to begin with. We're here because of the Lord's unending love and because of his grace. We are believing people. And as belonging and believing people, we are bearing fruit. Not wild grapes, but we're bearing the Lord's fruit. His righteousness, his justice, his tzedakah, his mishpat in our lives. 2 years ago, in Pennsylvania, the state confiscated 2,500 bottles of wine from a man named Arthur Goldman. Now, Arthur Goldman was just a resident of Pennsylvania. He wasn't anybody special. He wasn't a dealer. He wasn't licensed to retail. He was just looking to make a buck. And so he would buy wine from wherever he could find it, and he would bring it into his house, and then he would sell it, and just to make money. But because he wasn't a dealer and he didn't have a license, the state confiscated all 2,500 bottles of wine. It was an old law that was on the books from back in Prohibition days that said that no individual resident of Pennsylvania could go outside the state and buy alcohol and then bring it across the borders. And so that's why the state confiscated. But that wasn't the only aspect of the law. The other part of the law was that if the state did confiscate somebody's alcohol, it either had to be destroyed, that is poured out, or it could be given to a hospital for its use. Now, back when this law was put on the books, close to 100 years ago, the hospitals would have used it for medicinal purposes. But we don't do that in our day and age. Hospitals don't prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. Although I had one nurse who was here this morning, Tess, and she told me when she was a nurse in England, this is back in the 70s and 80s, that in England the hospitals would actually prescribe Guinness to a patient sometimes if they needed it. So it would come with lunch. They would put it on a prescription, and with lunch they would get their lunch and a bottle of Guinness. But in those days, people did that. But in our day and age, 2015, 2017, people aren't prescribing alcohol for medicinal uses. And yet the hospital in Chester County, Pennsylvania said, hey, there's something to this. And so they petitioned the court to be able to have that 2,500 bottles of wine. And they said, we could use this. We'll have an auction. We'll serve it to our donors at the auction. We'll raise a lot of funds, and it'll be really helpful to the hospital. It'll all go to a great cause. It'll be good. It'll be just. It'll be right. But the county court judge said that wasn't the original intent of the law. And so he did not allow them to have it. And the person I was reading who wrote this article in the paper put at the end of the article, let's hope there's an appeal. I don't know what you think about that. I don't know if you think that's just or unjust, or maybe there's some seeming injustice that all that wine would just go to waste and it could be put to a noble purpose. Even the judge said that would have been a noble purpose, but it wasn't the original intent of the law. But if that seeming injustice bothers you, that's just a drop. I mean, just a drop compared to what it is if you and I, the planting of the Lord's vineyard, are not bearing the fruit of righteousness and justice, and sharing it into the lives of other people around us. So let's hope that the Lord's word today becomes an appeal that overturns that in your life and mine.